I wasn't given the test of trying to do it on Sunday morning last time. I've been promoted to the most difficult slot, I think. So as your sort of hangovers recede, let me see if I can keep you sort of awake for about half an hour. Lessons for today, I'm doing something quite dangerous. I am an economic historian by trade, but I want to talk about the implications of study of the Great Depression for thinking about today's policy problems. Many economic historians would see that as disgraceful and not at all what a proper academic should do. So please don't tell them. Okay. Great Depression of the 1930s, what I want to just remind you of is this is an episode when prices fall a lot, that's what I mean by deflation. Unemployment rises in many countries to really quite frightening levels, that's the slump, and associated with that GDP falls. Crises, financial crises. Banking crises, banking systems fail, and currency crises would be part of that. And that, of course, links to the collapse of the gold standard, the fixed exchange rate system, which had prevailed so successfully in much of the 19th century and had been reinstated in the 1920s. 1930s is also, I think, very interesting from our present concerns in economics because it's life at the zero lower bound. Nominal interest rates in many countries were very close to zero, at least for short-term rates, probably little scope to cut them any further. We haven't actually had a great deal of experience in the West of living with interest rates that low, but we're back there now. So that's interesting. And perhaps cheerfully from today's perspective, although the early 1930s were really bad news, the later 1930s in many countries saw pretty strong recoveries. The recovery in Britain, for example, after 1933 is something the present government and certainly the Eurozone would die for. Anybody who's been to a talk by me before knows that I love numbers. I'm really should have been an accountant. I'm at least an anorak, and so I have to show you a few numbers as we go through. Let me substantiate what I just said for the advanced countries at that time with these numbers. You'll see the average decline in real GDP was nearly 17% from an index number of 100 in 1929, but you'll also see the strong recovery in 1934, 5, 6 and so on. Prices, that's prices of traded goods in the international economy. They fell by nearly 30% and recovered somewhat in the later 1930s, so you did move from price deflation to inflation. Unemployment on an international basis you can only measure in industry. That undoubtedly exaggerates unemployment for economies as a whole, but you can see the very steep and shocking rise in the early 1930s. There's a chart which might be familiar to many people. I have reproduced it effectively from Reinhardt and Rogoff. The left-hand side, the axis is the percentage of countries weighted by their share of world income experiencing a banking crisis, and there we can see the Great Depression really standing out. Now, I'm going to suggest 6 myths. I'd be amazed if any of you didn't believe at least one of these. Some of you may be stupid enough to believe all 6. If you do believe all 6, you really should listen awfully carefully for the next few minutes, because I'm going to basically disabuse you of all these. Best you can say for any of these is they might be a half-truth. I think most of them are actually myths. All right, the first one I think is probably one of the most common. Talk to a person in a bar, and I think you'll get the answer if you ask them what caused the Great Depression. The Wall Street crash surely had something to do with it. The stock market prices fall of October 1929 is what we usually think of the start of the crash, and prices went on falling, on average at least, for the following 3.5 years. I'm going to suggest to you that we are unable really to show that the Wall Street crash was either an entirely exogenous event or that it really had an adverse impact on Main Street. On the contrary, I think most of the stock price falls are endogenous, and the transmission channel is completely unclear. Secondly, a Great Depression in the UK in the 1930s? Surely not. GDP from peak to trough fell at most 7%. That's on a quarterly basis. Actually, on an annual basis, it's probably under 6%. That looks pretty like the recession we've just been through. This is not the 25% fall in GDP that you see in the United States. Why do we think that the UK had such a bad time in the 1930s? because there was a lot of underlying unemployment, not because GDP fell by a lot. Rearmament rescued the UK from the Depression. That's wrong on at least 3 counts. The beginning of the recovery came from monetary policy. Rearmament was a modest fiscal stimulus at most, and the fiscal multiplier was probably quite low. Only 3 reasons why that's wrong. Okay, second set of myths. Roosevelt's New Deal was a massive fiscal stimulus. Oh no, it wasn't. It's a modest fiscal boost, and it's not the main part of American recovery. The Glass-Steagall Act, that was the reform of banking in the United States, as I think many of you would know. The Glass-Steagall Act was evidence-based policy. Oh no, it wasn't. It was the capture of the unit banking regulatory pressure, political capture, if you like. The Glass-Steagall Act actually made the American banking system less safe, not more safe. The United States was mired in secular stagnation in the 1930s. Larry Summers has reinvented this term, which we owe to Alvin Hansen. Actually, on the contrary, the United States had a very high natural rate of growth in the 1930s. Let's go to the US then and say a few things about it. There you can see a more spectacular fall in real GDP, about 27% from peak to trough in the 1930s. Again, you can see the strong bounce back. Prices fall a lot. This is savage price deflation in the early part of the decade. Unemployment, which is now based on a measure for the whole economy, unemployment shot up to record levels. Taking the first of my myths then, impact of the Wall Street crash on the real economy. What we're talking about here is a stock market decline, spectacular decline at various points. First of all, it could have been neutralised by monetary policy action, I suspect, and the similar fall in October 1987 was indeed neutralised. If you want to suggest that there is an exogenous component in stock prices, I think that's possibly fair enough. They move more than you could justify by reasonable stories about profit expectations. But nevertheless, even if there is such an exogenous component, you've got to find a transmission mechanism into the world economy. Into the real economy. The 3 possibilities, I think, are wealth effects, uncertainty, or balance sheet effects. Don't think we've ever been able to find the balance sheet effect story for this period. Peter Temin years ago showed that the wealth effect story is very small, affects directly on consumption. I think that leaves us with uncertainty. Lots of economists at the moment are trying to investigate uncertainty and how it affects the economy. Nicholas Bloom at Stanford being the most obvious one of those. I think that might deserve a bit more scrutiny. So on the Wall Street crash, I might give you a half-truth, that there could be something to the uncertainty channel. If the crash causes enough uncertainty and investment decisions get seriously postponed, there is a route into the real economy. We have, however, very easily been able to show that banking failures in the United States did create most of the downturn. They made an initial recession into a depression. And that has been shown, I think, in recent literature by a number of quite famous economists. We can certainly say the American banking system was weak at the start of the Depression. We can also say that regulation was lacking. Ben Bernanke, he who became the governor of the Fed, initially showed in the early 1980s that the banking declines led to a major credit crunch in the economy that hugely exacerbated the effects of monetary contraction on output and left banks deleveraging and trying to repair their balance sheets. So whilst we've found it hard to link the stock market crash to the decline, we found it easy to link the banking crisis to the decline. There's a little graph to show the sort of successive waves of bank failures in the United States. We also know there was a big policy mistake here. Since I was a student in Cambridge, I have to swallow hard before saying this, but Friedman and Schwartz were largely right about this proposition. Friedman and Schwartz, in their seminal history of the United States monetary system, argued that the Federal Reserve System bore a huge part of the blame for what happened because it could have rescued the American banking system by being an effective lender of last resort. I think that's basically correct. And I think one might say in particular that recent evidence has pointed that way. If you haven't ever read it, the paper by Richardson and Troost in the Journal of Political Economy in 2009 is a fantastic piece of modern empirical economics. It basically takes a quasi-natural experiment, looks at what happens in the state of Mississippi, which was divided into two Federal Reserve districts, and the Federal Reserve banks behaved quite differently. The Atlanta Fed and the St. Louis Fed took different actions in 1930-31 with very different consequences. This experiment, or quasi-experiment, suggests a more effective lender of last resort could have made a big difference. On the Glass-Steagall Act, Eugene White years ago showed that investment banking should not have been divorced from commercial banking by the Glass-Steagall Act, because prior to the crisis and during the crisis, banks which had both a securities arm and a commercial retail arm were less likely to fail, not more likely to fail, than banks which were separated. White showed that the Sharpe ratio looks hugely better if you have universal banking in this period. Return relative to risk looks much better for banks with a security affiliate. The Glass-Steagall Act was not evidence-based policy. It was the political capture of the unit banking lobby. New Deal and recovery, well, let's turn to that. Lots of you will have heard of the New Deal, the alphabet soup of initiatives, Works Progress Administration, the Tennessee Valley Authority, all those sorts of things. It's been known for at least 60 years, though, that the New Deal did not significantly raise aggregate demand, nor was it a major injection of deficit finance into the economy. Probably did have some effects on the efficiency of the labour market, that's for another day. If you do want to say the New Deal mattered, then I think a modern economist would say it might have mattered as part of a package which changed inflationary expectations. The channel of influence on the economy would not be raising aggregate demand through more fiscal spending power, but through lowering the real interest rate. And perhaps this was particularly appropriate at the lower bound for nominal interest rates. And Gauti Eggertson's paper with the great title, Great Expectations, tells that story in some detail. Fiscal stimulus, well, the best we can measure it, the New Deal added about 2.5% to GDP. We don't really know whether fiscal policy would have worked in that economy because it wasn't really tried. If we want to talk about the end of one big deflation, those of you who think of Sargent will think of the end of one big inflation. Here's one big deflation. We need to explain the lower turning point. I think the lower turning point was leaving the gold standard. It was the end of the Hoover regime in April 1933, which changed expectations about what was going to happen to prices. This freed American monetary policy from the constraints of the gold standard. It meant there would be an era of rising prices, not falling prices. This is close to the so-called classic solution to the liquidity trap, where really what you need to do is credibly to commit to future inflation. Maybe the New Deal is part of that credible commitment. Certainly that's what Eggertson would argue. There's a chart for ex-post real interest rates. They're probably easier to measure than ex-ante ones, I give you that. But even so, I don't think there's much doubt. We know that real interest rates were horrendously high in the early 30s. The solution to the lower turning point and bounce back was to get those real interest rates down. How did you do that? By regime change, by leaving the gold standard, by making the central bank a dependent central bank, by allowing gold inflows to reinflate the money supply and changing inflationary expectations. Alvin Hansen thought the United States in the 1930s faced secular stagnation. There are various flavors of that. Let me interpret it for this morning as this is an economy with low trend growth prospects. The low trend growth implies weakness of investment demand in the short term, and with this demand missing, then a Keynesian unemployment problem was always a possibility. Alvin Hansen was spectacularly wrong. I love these slides. I've got lots of them. It's not appropriate for today, but I've got one, why was Robert Solow wrong, for example. If I thought hard, I might have a why was Jim Mirrlees wrong, but I haven't yet. He'll tip me off and I'll do it for a future lecture. Why was Alvin Hansen wrong? I think he's wrong firstly because the American economy was recovering very strongly at the time he wrote. Regime change had done its bit. But much more importantly for the medium long-term prospects of the US, this was a period of strong technological progress, or in growth accounting terms, strong TFP growth. Strong TFP growth essentially meant that the trend rate of growth of the economy, of productivity and so on, was really rather high. One recent author even described the 1930s as the most technologically progressive decade of the 20th century. I think that's typical American hype. It's wrong, but nevertheless, it was a period of very strong productivity growth. If you do standard growth accounting, contributions to labour productivity growth, those are perfectly standard notation there. The TFP column is the one that we would want to look at. TFP growth in the interwar period in the United States averaged over 2% a year, possibly stronger than after World War II. Those would be Alexander Field's estimates. I think he may have slightly over-egged the pudding, but I think the basic story is correct. All right, from the US to the UK. The UK in the 1930s, first of all, notice, it didn't have a very big decline in real GDP. I said that in the headlines at the start. Prices fell in the UK, but not nearly as much as in the United States. Unemployment rose, but not so spectacularly. But the British economy had already an unemployment problem in the 1920s. What was that unemployment problem to do with? I think contemporaries would have thought of it as a structural unemployment problem. It's to do with the problem of old industries in what at the time they called Outer Britain. Probably a politically incorrect phrase today. It's roughly speaking north of Birmingham, west of Bristol, the UK in those regions. So the UK downturn was short and mild, relatively speaking. The UK fits the international pattern, as I'll spell out in a bit more detail in a moment. It left the gold standard very early, and not a single bank failed in the UK. Quite an interesting thought. But the reason we still think of the 1930s as traumatic is unemployment. Unemployment rates for insured workers were typically quite high. Not everybody was an insured worker. These are a bit higher than the sort of story for the economy if you go beyond the national insurance system. But nevertheless, they'll do for our purpose. Look at Wales in that chart. Wales basically has high unemployment in 1929, very high unemployment in 1932, pretty high unemployment in 1937. Most of you will have heard of the Jarrow Marchers, the shipbuilding workers who marched from the northeast to London in the mid-1930s. When they got to London in 1936, they must have thought they were in a foreign country. Look at the unemployment rate in London. That's basically a fully employed economy once again by 1937. Devaluation in the 1930s was typically the key to recovery for many countries. Let's just check why. The gold standard was a fixed exchange rate system with mobile capital. Macroeconomic trilemma, that precludes independent monetary policy, at least for a small country. Coordinated monetary expansion might have been possible, but politically that was never on. So leaving the gold standard was therefore very good for early recovery. Staying on the gold standard made things much worse. If you leave the gold standard, what advantages does it give you? It allows you to regain control of your interest rate, independent monetary policy. It allows you, in principle, to change inflationary expectations by credibly announcing a new policy, and it eases pressure in the labour market. Leaving the gold standard was what allowed regime change. If you're thinking about the Eurozone today, there is no way of leaving the Eurozone in the way that you could leave the gold standard in the 1930s. Countries left the gold standard at different times. Broadly speaking, what that table shows is the sooner you left, the faster you return to the 1929 income level. Germany, strictly speaking, never did leave the gold standard. Denmark never did have a decline in real GDP per person. The UK recovery, we've already seen in an earlier chart that it was quite rapid. It's based initially on monetary stimulus. If anything, fiscal policy is pointing in the other direction in the early 1930s. The exit from the gold standard led Britain into the era of cheap money, and one of the clear transmission mechanisms into the real economy was through housing. All those 1930s semi-detached. From 1935 onwards, it is fair to say that there is a rearmament process. Rearmament is an exogenous fiscal shock, a positive one. It was perhaps a de facto Keynesian policy, but my own estimates suggest that its impact on real GDP, while possibly welcome, is surely not the main story of the recovery. Cheap money policy is really very interesting. The Bank of England is taken over by the Treasury. The Treasury has a strong interest in raising prices, and the reason for that is in particular the large overhang of government debt which it has to manage. I think that makes the Treasury able credibly to commit to modest inflation. Let's turn from the past to something a bit closer to the present. I've suggested that leaving the gold standard really was very helpful to countries wanting to recover quickly in the 1930s. Let's just check on the euro area today. Fair to say, I think, that although recovery is on the way, it's modest, and you could see this area is still recovering from a very lengthy recession. 1930s experience says devalue, and if necessary, perhaps the government defaults as well. But this route to recovery has clearly been unavailable for whatever reason. I said on the slide blocked. We could perhaps debate that in due course. I'm going to suggest that what the Eurozone faces is a design from which it can't escape and which precludes the recovery mechanisms that were successful in the 1930s. Being in the Eurozone effectively precludes regime change. It is not possible to have a New Deal of the Roosevelt type. And that old British expression that I seem to remember learning at school when we did geography about sailing ships, being stuck in the doldrums, does seem indeed to be the right metaphor here. And indeed, when we look at the numbers, the euro area today looks like the rather bereaved countries of the gold bloc in the 1930s, not the sterling bloc. Look at real GDP in two crisis periods, the 1930s and the recent past. Basically, at the start of the crisis in each case, year one is indexed as 100, and then each year into the crisis, you move forward one. The grey line there is the sterling bloc in the 1930s, mainly Britain, but its satellite countries in Scandinavia as well. Leaving the gold standard early, you recover very quickly. The gold bloc countries stayed on the gold standard, didn't have their escape mechanism through 1936. Only at the end of 1936 did the remaining gold countries leave the exchange rate standard. That's the yellow line. The red line is the euro area today. I think that expression, beloved of some British politicians, flatlining, really does apply to the euro area through that graph. But notice that, as of about 2015, relative to the start, it looks like the gold bloc, not the sterling bloc. And if we think about the European Monetary Union compared with the gold standard, the most obvious feature to mention is that leaving the gold standard was much easier than leaving the euro. Effectively, the euro is a trap from which you cannot leave, except probably at fairly catastrophic cost. The gold standard, countries still had their currencies. It was much easier to impose capital controls. Effectively, you could leave without any fear of endangering the banking system. That makes a massive difference. So the recent study by O'Rourke and Taylor says exit from the gold standard was easy, but not from euro. Why does the Eurozone struggle at the zero lower bound? the design of the Eurozone is exactly wrong for a depressed economy. The central bank is precluded from trying to achieve regime change. You can't reduce real interest rates enough. Fiscal stimulus is ruled out at the national level, and helicopter money is indeed explicitly forbidden. On to the last slide. The amber light's been showing for some time, so we'd better scuttle through this before the red light comes on. Let me say what I take the lessons from this to be. You might think some of them have been heeded in the recent past. Some of them perhaps are not applicable or not capable of being used. Preventing collapse of the banking system is paramount. I think that tells you that you want an active, vigorous lender of last resort. Letting banks fail has massive effects on real output. You might also interpret preventing as saying you'd like good regulation to try and preclude the problem in the first place. Regime change is the key to recovery in a depressed economy. Changing inflationary expectations is the only way to reduce real interest rates at the lower bound. Falling prices are much more damaging than rising prices because they commit you to very high real interest rates. Finally, being in a depression, in a major crisis, lots of people seem to equate that with producing a period, an era that follows of secular stagnation. The experience of the United States surely says that's not right. That's putting 2 and 2 together and making 7. What secular stagnation depends on is your ability to achieve technological progress. If you can do that, you won't suffer from secular stagnation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Crofts. If we could now open the floor to Q&A, just raise your hand. Can we go to the gentleman on the right there first, please?
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting.
Sorry, if you could hold the mic.
You talked about the Glass-Steagall Act, and correct me if I'm wrong, you didn't seem to be overly impressed with its achievements, and you argued that it increased the risk of failure rather than decrease it. But was that actually what the Glass-Steagall Act was supposed to do? I mean, was it supposed to lower the risk of failure, or was it not rather there to ensure that if a bank fails, the repercussions to the commercial sector are limited, and by separating the commercial sector, ensuring that the borrowers and the commercial customers are not affected by the failure?
We're taking one at a time?
It's up to you.
Yeah. Thank you for your question. Good point. I think the Glass-Steagall Act has always been sold by its proponents as something which would increase financial stability. So I think it is intended to be something which would reduce the rate of bank failures. And the evidence suggests that that is a misconception about the nature of the 1930s economy. I think, ironically, the Glass-Steagall Act might have been more useful at the time that it was abolished at the end of the 1990s than it was in the 1930s. The point about the 1930s is nearly all banks were very small. Almost no bank on its own could cause a systemic failure. It's when banks are too big to fail that you need to design new ways of perhaps reining in moral hazard and perhaps worrying about excessive risk-taking in the banking system. If you ask what was it that was also there to promote greater financial stability and things which did make more sense in the 1930s, the American government did improve things, mainly by making most banks have to be regulated by the Fed rather than their local state, and also by increasing quite substantially capital requirements, and by putting banks through bank stress tests, which meant that the Fed closed quite a lot of banks in April 33. So there was rehabilitation of the banking system. I'm just trying to argue that I don't think the Glass-Steagall Act was the key integral part of it.
Thank you. The gentleman in the front there.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. My name is Georgi. I'm from Lancaster University. I actually during the second year of my studies, I did a similar research, not so deep and not so academic, of course, on the application of the Keynesian theory today. As we all know, it's based on the Great Depression. But I don't know why you didn't mention the Sir James May plan in the UK, which was actually a very controversial policy compared to the Keynesian traditional approach to solving such problems. Can you comment on Sir James May plan?
Okay, I think you mean the report of the May Committee, which came out in 1931. It was hiding there in the sense of one of the slides mentioned that there was probably a 4% of GDP change in the structural budget position in the early 1930s, moving towards a stronger surplus. That did come about in the context of the May Committee's recommendations to cut government expenditure. Those recommendations were partly carried through, not wholly, but they did change the fiscal position. I think most people, including me, would think that the initial effect of the May Committee report and the extent to which the fiscal changes were made was probably adding to the downturn rather than the opposite. Although my own research suggests that fiscal multipliers in Britain in the 1930s were low, I don't think they were negative. I think they were positive, and the range that my estimates suggest is somewhere probably between about 0.3, maybe 0.4, up to about 0.8, perhaps less than 1, but positive. The implication then is I'm not believing, as some people would, in expansionary fiscal contraction. So I don't think that's the key to thinking about Britain in the 1930s. The footnote that might surprise you that I'm saying the multiplier was not very high, even in an economy with quite a lot of unemployment and well below perhaps productive potential. I think what modern research has taught us is that the fiscal multiplier is hugely contingent on circumstances. And maybe the circumstance that's relevant in Britain in the 1930s is the very large overhang of public debt, together with the massive pressure on the government to balance the budget. I think it's very difficult then for agents to believe that any announcement of government spending won't actually lead quite quickly to a lot more taxation. I think, in other words, the 1930s is probably a bit closer to an era of Ricardian equivalence than some other episodes.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we had one more question, the delegate at the back there.
Thank you, Mr. Crofts. I just wanted to ask you, based on the banking sector, where do you draw the line between banks being too big to fail and too small to succeed? And especially considering that we need a sort of a profitable banking industry to succeed in this new macroeconomic environment. And I think there's a big issue in terms of Europeans being very consumerist and not allowing banks to generate capital organically. What are your thoughts on this?
Good question. I certainly think one has to be thoughtful in regulating banks as to the efficiency consequences, not as it were simply the financial stability consequences. I think in British terms, incidentally, that was very well handled by the Vickers Commission, which was extremely alert to both aspects of the problem. I think what you get from that is probably it doesn't necessarily make sense to separate what the Americans would call investment banking from commercial banking. There probably are, for example, some economies of scope, which ideally you would want to realise. I think what we have been guilty of, however, is allowing banks to run with far too high levels of leverage and far too little equity capital. Can I recommend to you in particular the study by David Miles and colleagues in the Economic Journal in 2013, in which David works out the consequences of requiring banks to hold rather more equity capital than they have done in the past. He points out the efficiency consequences for the economy seem to be trivially small compared with the insurance gains of reducing the probability of hitting another banking crisis. So I agree there's a trade-off. I agree that one needs to think about both aspects, but I suspect that that would still leave me, along with John Vickers, thinking the banks had too little equity capital, were allowed to have too little equity capital in the run-up to 2007.
I think we have time for one more question, if anyone in the audience. Gentleman at the front there.
Hi, Mr. Crafts. Thank you for your speech. It was very interesting to listen to. I just wanted to ask about a similar act that was implemented in 2012, I believe, to Glass-Steagall Act, that prohibited banks to do both investment banking and commercial banking. And do you think that would eliminate a new financial crisis similar to that happened in 2007, 2008?
It might reduce the chances of having a financial crisis, but I think in my previous answer what I was trying to say is, as my granny would have said, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. In other words, you do have to be aware that draconian regulation potentially has consequences for efficiency, for innovation, that you don't entirely want to see. Think of the American banking system in the 1950s and 1960s. It delivered more or less perfect financial stability. There was no serious banking crisis in the United States between the 1930s and the savings and loans problems of the 1980s. But I think most observers would agree it did so at quite significant cost to innovation in the American financial system. So I repeat, I think it's a matter of careful judgment on that trade-off.
Thank you very much. Can we please have another round of applause, please?